I was originally going to talk about the book The Paw Prints of History on this podcast, which is a really interesting book. It's kind of like events in history that you already know about and how dogs played a role in a way that you didn't realize. For example, we know that St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland, but what a lot of people don't know is the role dogs played in that happening. So he was a British guy, actually, Patrick. And when he was a teenager, some Irish marauders landed on the shore, came up and stole him and took him back to Ireland and made him a slave. And he was a shepherd, sheep herder, and he had dogs that helped him do this job. And he was a sheep herder for years, all by himself, except for the dogs. So he became really good with dogs. And eventually, when he made it back to civilization, he had spent a lot of time praying while he was out there by himself because he was cold and alone and in a foreign land and miserable. So he prayed a lot. He prayed like 100 times a day. And during that time, he became kind of like a holy man. So when he got back to Britain, England, he kept having these visions of the Irish people calling him back to come save them. So he decided he was going to do that, and he eventually became a bishop and then went back to Ireland to bring Christianity to Ireland. But when he arrived there, of course, they already had their own religion. And the Druids were kind of like the high priests of that religion. And they planned on killing him when he arrived. They knew that he was coming for that purpose. It was a competing religion, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So they were just going to kill him when he showed up. And they unleashed their wolfhounds on him. And you probably know what a wolfhound is. I think it's the largest dog in the world, or at least one of them. It's a huge dog. And back then, they were actually much bigger than they are even today. And they unleashed their dogs on him, and he was so good with dogs that they didn't attack him. He knew how to deal with them, and the Druids were really impressed with this and decided not to kill him, and that was the beginning of him having influence in Ireland. And he eventually really changed Ireland, and actually in a way changed the world, because in a really good book called How the Irish Saved Civilization, they talk in there about how at the time the world, the European world, was descending into darkness and people stopped being taught how to read. The Roman Empire had fallen apart, and so all of the structure that they had put into place just kind of disappeared, and all of the accumulated books and knowledge from Greek and Roman times was disappearing. But at the same time that this was happening, St. Patrick was bringing Christianity to Ireland, and one of the things that his monks did is copy books. He taught them to make books out of sheepskin, and he taught them to write and to copy books. Now, originally, it was just copying the Bible. That's how they got the Bible to be all over Ireland. But then they kept copying. It was like the main religious activity of these monks was copying books. And I mean, like they're doing it by hand. This is before the printing press, right? So they are copying books, and they start collecting books. Whenever one of these monks or bishops or whatever travels through Europe, whenever they come across a good book, they bring it back and copy it. Right? And because they did this, they kind of saved civilization in the form of the accumulated literature and scientific knowledge that was being lost, but had been accumulated by Roman and Greek culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. They saved it. And because they saved it, it actually helped create the Enlightenment when the Dark Ages were over. Anyway, so that's a really interesting book, especially if you're Irish, I imagine. Another really interesting example from the paw prints of history is how the Spanish conquered Mexico. One of the things, they had a lot of advantages, the Spanish. They had literature, they had diseases, they had steel armor, they had horses. But one of the things that you probably haven't heard about is that they had war dogs. that had been bred and trained to be a weapon in war. They were huge Mastiff-like dogs that could tear off an arm off of somebody. And they would have, when they went into battle, they would have like 100 of these dogs, and they would just start charging these guys in their armor started charging on horseback, and their dogs would run out ahead of them and just go into the crowd and just start tearing off arms. And of course, this completely intimidated the Aztec warriors. They had never seen anything like this. I mean, they actually had dogs. Dogs were one of the few species that were actually domesticated by every people all over the world. Every continent had domesticated dogs as of 500 years ago. But anyway, they had dogs, but their dogs were small, and they actually raised dogs. They had bred dogs just for producing meat. It was one of their few domesticated animals, and they raised some breeds of dogs. They just raised for meat, and anyway, they'd never seen anything like this, and they were rightfully freaked out by it. And it helped Cortez conquer the Aztecs. There's another historical place where the history, you've heard of this history, but did you ever hear about the part dogs played in this, a really important part? Me neither. But now I'm reading a book. It's called The Invaders. And this is even a more significant part dogs played in history, because the author's thesis is that, that Neanderthals dominated Europe for 180,000 years, right? And then modern humans migrated into that area, and within a very short amount of time, the Neanderthals ceased to exist. They went extinct. And there's been a lot of theories about how that happened, why that happened. Did humans kill them off? What happened? They know there was a little bit of interbreeding. Europeans and Asians have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in our DNA, so they know that there was some interbreeding. But that's not what happened. I mean, it was a very small percentage. There was a little bit going on, but we didn't absorb them. They died out. And when we come back, we'll find out what this author thinks really happened. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started. So, how did the arrival of modern humans kill off the Neanderthal? Not because we ourselves were such a formidable species, because the Neanderthals were probably as sophisticated technically as we were at the time, and they were bigger and stronger, not taller, but thicker, more muscular. And they had big brains, and they made tools and spears, and I mean, they had a lot of the same stuff that we had. They were a formidable match for us. So how did these scrawnier humans displace them so completely? It wasn't just us that showed up. It was modern humans in a close, cooperative relationship with dogs. That's like a super predator. Humans and dogs together could outhunt Neanderthals, could outhunt humans without dogs. It was such a deadly combination that they went extinct. They couldn't compete with us. One of the points that the author is making is that humans and dogs together were the ultimate invasive species. The author did a lot of research about invasive species and gives the reader some background about what invasive species do and what happens when the invasive species goes into a new area and starts killing off the easiest to kill things, And like when Native Americans first arrived in North America, there were all kinds of big animals like giant sloths that were slow and easy to hunt, and they wiped them out. When a new invasive hunter, especially predator, comes into an area, it really changes the landscape. If you've ever seen that, there's a really great video of what happened when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone. I don't know how long ago they killed off the wolves in the area, and so there hadn't been wolves in Yellowstone for a long time. And certain things had changed in the meantime, and when the wolves came back in, they changed back. So one of the things that happened is the elk population started going down when the wolves showed up, and elk had been eating the small saplings, tree saplings, near the rivers, which made the banks less stable, which means the rivers had were changing course more often. So when there were fewer elk and the elk were more afraid because there was this new predator in town, they stayed away from the banks of the rivers, which is a clear area and easy to catch. So they stayed away from them. So the trees started growing. So the banks of the rivers started becoming more stable. Anyway, there were all these cascading effects from a new predator coming into an area. Well, they believe that the same thing happened. The author of this book, Pat Shipman, says that the cascading effects of this new invasive species really influenced the mammoth population, the cave bear population, and the Neanderthal population. One of the more interesting things in this book is that there is very good evidence that wolves had already been domesticated into dogs 36,000 years ago. Now, in comparison, researchers generally think that humans domesticated other animals 13,000 years ago, 12, 13, 14,000 years ago, something in there. But the first animal to be domesticated was the dog, and far before any other animal. 36,000 years ago? That's amazing. It's a good match, though. I mean, you can understand why dogs and humans get along so well. They're very similar. Wolves are pack hunters. Humans are pack hunters. They're both very social animals. They live in groups, have close relationships with each other, and they have complementary talents. Humans can obviously make tools. They can plan, strategize, but they also, well, wolves can do that too. They do some pretty good strategy when they're hunting. But humans have really good eyesight, and dogs have really good hearing and really good noses. Dogs are faster, and they know how to hunt together and cooperate. It was a great match. It really turned a human into a super predator, more deadly than a group of wolves and more deadly than a group of humans. Another interesting parallel between dogs and humans is that we have whites of our eyes. Not a lot of animals have this, and there is no other primate that has this other than humans. I mean, it does occasionally occur in other primates, just as a fluke, but for the most part, we're the only ones. And the difference that makes is that you can see where the person is looking. When the whites of their eyes are white rather than the same color as the eyes are dark, you can see the direction of the gaze. And that is true with dogs also. And both dogs and humans pay attention to the gaze. They tried to do an experiment with other apes. I think it was chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. And they actually gave up the experiment. They wanted to see if those apes followed the gaze of the researcher and how well they followed. And they gave up the experiment because they didn't even look at where the person was looking. They did an experiment where they turned their head one way but looked the other way, and they would look in the direction that the person turned their head. Like they clearly were not paying attention to where the person was looking. And so not only do we share that with dogs, we share not only the whites of the eyes, but dogs really pay attention to where you're looking, what direction that you're looking. And that, of course, would be a really good adaptation for cooperative hunting. And that was in the book, The Invaders. Wolves also look at gazes, at where the direction of someone gazing, especially a human. If
if the wolf was raised by humans, but dogs even then are still do it way more and are very much better at it than wolves are. So this adaptation, among many others, may have allowed humans and dogs to really cooperate and ultimately wipe out by outcompeting Neanderthals, which, they were in Europe for 180,000 years. They were a very, very successful species. They'd gone through multiple ice ages and survived. Then humans come along and immediately their numbers start to drop. It could be that the combination of humans and dogs was such a stiff competition they could not compete. And of course, that really changed history. Dogs have changed history since we first became an ally with them. Two apex predators allied together became an unstoppable force on this planet. And we're still allied together even today. Dogs are used in all kinds of important things, like obviously search and rescue, and as comfort dogs, as service dogs, and as just a companion in life. People that have a dog tend to be healthier. They recover from heart attacks faster. Just petting your dog raises your oxytocin level, which is very healthy. They're a responsibility, they cost money, but they have changed so many lives for the better, and they've changed history. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.